On today's episode, we're going to talk about orgasms and sex. For those of you for whom this might be triggering, skip this episode. Come back to the next. Hi, wonderful people. I'm Leah Rapanner. As a sociologist, University of Melbourne professor, founder of the Gender Equity Initiative, director of the Future of Work Lab, woman, wife, and mother, I've made it my life's mission to take down every ridiculous gender myth out there. Together, we'll deep dive into the research to get to the bottom of all these misperceptions that are holding all of us back. Don't worry, I've studied these types of questions for decades, and after publishing countless articles exactly on these topics, I know when they are nonsense or real truths. And I'm going to help you learn that too. So here we go. Let's do it. This is Misperceived. Did you have an orgasm last night? I know you're already uncomfortable with this line of question, but don't go away. Stay with me. Was it with your partner? Were you alone? Did you have sex? Was it intimacy? What did it look like? And do you feel like I'm already prying too much? Are you in your car, in the bath, on the road, and you're already blushing? Get ready. On today's episode of Misperceived, we're going to talk about, wait for it, the orgasm gap. We're going to unpack the question, is it a misperception that women have fewer orgasms than men? And really, is this just all about aging? Do we just over time have this decline in orgasm with age? I'm going to talk to you about an article that just got published, and it's called The Lifelong Orgasm Gap, Exploring Age's Impact on Orgasm Rates. Now, this is coming through Sexual Medicine, and it's with a team of researchers, Amanda Gelselman, Margaret Bennett Brown, Simon Dupé, Ellen Kaufman, Jessica Campbell, and Justin Garcia. And what they were interested in is they were interested in understanding whether there is, in fact, an orgasm gap by age, whether women have fewer orgasms across their lifetimes, and whether this varies by sexual orientation. So is this something that just happens as we get older, our bodies start to break down, and we start to see that there's a gap that widens between men and women and across sexual orientations? So let's talk a little bit about this. What is the orgasm gap? Well, there's research showing that heterosexual women have fewer or lower orgasm rates than men and lesbian women. And as I told you in that Let's Talk Dirty Dishes episode, there's a lot of reasons why women could have fewer orgasms, or really it could have less sex, right? And when I talked to you about that in that episode, I was kind of unpacking the reasons why sexual frequency might be lower amongst women than men and why it might go down over time. And again, I told you that it might just be kind of burnout, that there might be these high levels of burnout. So we're going to switch from sexual frequency, but I want you to hold on to that episode. If you don't remember it, go back and listen again, because we had a good discussion about how do we measure sex, how do we measure sexual frequency, sexual quality, and I'm going to give you a little bit of that in this episode too. So I'm going to tell you again, sex and orgasms are two very different things, in particular for women. So on this episode, we're going to talk about this orgasm gap, and what we need to know is that women report having fewer orgasms than men. What we know from the research is that men's sexual orientation doesn't have an impact on orgasm rates. So basically, men from LGBTIQ plus relationships have the same level in reporting of orgasms as men in heterosexual unions. But if we look at women, we see something slightly different. We see that those who are in lesbian relationships report higher orgasm rates. They also perceive that their partners are having more orgasms as well. And one of the things they talk about in this research article is the way in which lesbians have sex can be different, that they are more likely to engage in and receive oral sex, right? They tend to have longer sexual frequency than heterosexual couples, that they are having basically longer and different sexual encounters than those in heterosexual partnerships. And there's evidence, right? Like, so that there's something really different happening in these different couples based on their sexual orientation. So there's this question about what's going on. Is this hormones? Is this aging? Is this knowledge? Is this anatomy? Is this sexual frequency? Like, what's going on over time? What they find is that in terms of sexual frequency, if you look at older women, as women age, they tend to report having fewer sexual activities than older men. They report that their desire for sex tends to go down, but they actually report that they have more satisfying sexual relationships than younger women. So they're having less frequent sex than older men, but when they do engage in these activities, they find them to be more satisfying. Of course, we know that men's sexual testosterone and their drive can deteriorate over time. If this is not true, we wouldn't have things like Viagra, right? That sexual functioning, there is an age piece in terms of the ways in which our blood moves through our bodies, our hormones, right? It's silly for us to decouple sex from biology, but it's important for us to understand that sex is social too, that it's not just biologically driven, that yes, we do have hormones, we do have biological urges, we do have sexual drives, we do have bodies that age, unfortunately for all of us, but it's important to think about sex as a social experience in addition to sex being a biological experience. So let's talk a little bit about what this new study does. So this study is taking 24,752 adults. That's a really big sample. And they're coming from the US, and they're taking people who are ranging from 18 years old to 100 years old. They ran basically 8 surveys, and the surveys ran from 2015 to 2023. And it's important for me to note that, because we talk a lot about data on this program, that these are not longitudinal data. This is not the same people being interviewed 8 times. It's just they're taking snapshots. So a snapshot in 2015 of one group, a snapshot in 2016 of one group, right? They're taking snapshots of people over time, but they're not the same people. What that means is we can't talk about, as Leah, gets older, what happens to my sexual frequency, sexual orgasm gap. But they're talking about if you look at me at one moment in time, and then they look at you at another moment in time, and then they look at your neighbor in another moment in time, and then they look at your parents. I'm sorry for telling you that, but your parents are probably having sex at another moment in time. What does it look like across this population? The good news is they have this really big sample, and that's helpful because often what happens is, it's hard for us to get everybody. It's hard for us to get older people, or it's harder for us to get younger people. And so they are taking this big sample and they're looking at the averages and the changes over time. The good news about the big sample too is that they can get a higher concentration of people who are basically not heterosexual, right? LGBTIQ plus population within their sample. So what they're doing is they're using this, I guess I just want to caveat this with you. They're using this Singles in America study. So, and what I want to say to you is these people are single. Now, not partnered. Okay, now I just threw you for a loop, right? Wait a minute. You're taking people from 18 to 100 and they're not partnered. They're single people. I want to just put that on the table. So this is not people in romantic relationships, but they're asking this question. I'll read it to you later on about, on average, do you? Now, you're probably wondering why in the world are they using single people when they're trying to understand sexual frequency and orgasms? Well, there's a couple reasons that they give. First is that single people are a big portion of the US population. They're about a third of the group. But also, this research was funded by, wait for it, Match.com. So okay, I don't think the data's bad, but there is some sort of incentive of Match.com to understand what's happening for single people. So of course they're studying single people because it's the client base. It's important for me to note for you because I looked into this and I was like, what's the story with this, right? Is this problematic? Should I tell it to you? And the answer is they're not recruiting from Match.com, right? This is not something where they go into the Match sample and recruit from their client base. No. They're doing this as academics and they're recruiting from the general population in all the ways that we typically do recruit, but they're just recruiting single people and they're making sure that it's representative in all of those types of things. It's just that the money came from Match. So I want you to think about how they're asking the question. Take a minute, put your feet up, close your eyes. I'm going to ask you the question, and how would you respond to this? When having sexual intercourse in general, what percentage of the time do you usually have an orgasm? That's the question. So the responses are made on a scale from 0 to 100. 0 would be none of the time. 100 is all of the time. They have, I told you this already, they get a good sample of lesbian and gay and bisexual respondents, but most of their sample, 86%, is heterosexual. And 14% is lesbian, gay, or bisexual participants. And that's roughly 3,300 people, which is not nothing, right? It's actually quite big. Let's talk about what they find. The first thing they find is that women report having fewer orgasms than men. So there is this orgasm gap by gender. And that cuts across all of the age groups. And across all the age groups, men had higher orgasm rates than women. So take, for example, what they found was that men report 70 to 85% of the time. And again, remember the question. The question is when having sexual intercourse in general. So when having sexual intercourse in general, men report having an orgasm 70 to 80% of the time. For women, it ranged from 46 to 58%. So half or less than half of the time. And so what that means is that men are having orgasm rates like pretty much almost all of the time, whereas women are having it half. So it's almost like 30% lower. Then the question they asked was, does age really matter? So remember I said to you, there's a couple of questions, like what's going on? Is there a gap in orgasms by gender? And then can we just say like, actually, a lot of this is just biological aging, that people have fewer orgasms over time, that as you get older, this explains away this gender difference? The answer is not really. They do find that, on average, orgasm rates go down with age, but then it goes slightly up. But the age effects are like really small. So what it is saying to you is if you're an orgasm person when you're young, you're an orgasm person when you're old. So it's like vanilla. You either like vanilla ice cream from birth till death. So you're either like someone who is consistently having an orgasm in your sexual encounters, your sex life, or not. And it doesn't really matter if you're aging over time. Then remember I told you the third question was, does sexual orientation matter? And the answer is kinda. So what they found was that older gay and bisexual men and older lesbian women did in fact have higher orgasm rates than their younger counterparts. And they make this argument that maybe these groups like better understand their bodies, that over time you understand your sexual needs. And as you age, you're more likely perhaps to have fewer sexual encounters, but higher quality ones. Like you're more likely to have an orgasm in them. But really, ultimately, what they're finding is that like this gap is kind of persistent across all the ages. And it's suggesting overall that it really isn't an aging effect and it really isn't a sexual orientation effect, but rather it's being driven by gender, that gender gap isn't explained away by aging and it isn't really explained away by sexual orientation. So there are some patterns, right? But the effects are small. So I guess what I'm saying is if you're going from 50% to 80%, it's not explaining away that 30% gap. Little margins, but not the whole thing. So what do we need to know about this? Okay, well, the first thing is that women may be less in touch with their sexuality and their sexual pleasure. And part of this is the way in which we police women's bodies. We tell women not to explore their bodies. We shame them around their bodies. And so we need to help women connect into their bodies to understand their own pleasure. Second is men might not understand women's bodies. This is a biological question, right? And so if women, and most of these people reporting are heterosexual singles, that we need to help men understand the anatomy of women, the biology of women, sexual pleasure amongst women. The third thing is that we often have this really weird understanding of what sex actually is. So again, the question on this is when having sexual intercourse in general, what percentage of the time do you have an orgasm? How do we define sexual intercourse? And this is where heteronormativity comes in. It's about heterosexual ideas of what sexual intercourse is, and usually it's penile vaginal intercourse. It's this really traditional expectation that sexual intercourse is defined when a penis enters a vagina. Now, let me just say this to you. I used to talk to the undergraduates about how do we define when you lose your virginity? Like, how do you set the threshold of losing our virginity? We often think about virginity being lost when women have penile vaginal sex, right? When they have their first sexual encounter with a penis inserted into a vagina. I don't know how else to say this. That's the answer, right? But the question is, what if you're not in these heterosexual relationships? Like, what if you are in a lesbian relationship from the minute you're born until the minute you die, right? Or are you actually thinking about, like, are we thinking about, oh no, lesbian women only lose their virginity when they have like some sort of penetration? Like, this is where you can see how absolutely nuts our understanding of sexual intercourse, which is often tied to virginity, which is often tied to pregnancy, which is often tied to heterosexuality, which is often tied to religion, which is often tied to risk. We could keep going, right? Back to the times. This is how we understand it. This is how we define it. And so if you have this definition and you ask people about sexual intercourse, then maybe this is the lens through which they're looking. And if we're looking through this lens about some sort of penile vaginal intercourse, then of course men are going to have the orgasms all the time, because that's not in itself defined as sexual intercourse. So this could be a bad question. This is my way of saying it's not a bad question, but it's a framed question where people are having this certain vision of what sexual intercourse is, and then they're reporting against it. And so women's orgasm rates actually might be higher. We might need to change the definition. We might need to ask different questions. And as I said to you at the beginning, we also might need to educate men to understand the anatomy of women. Women have an incredible concentration of nerve endings in the clitoris. Full stop, period. That's it. It's like a modern miracle. It's like a medical advance. It's like the only part of the human body that has the deepest concentration in the smallest area. And in that way, it's thinking about the unique ways in which women's anatomy is designed that is similar to men's anatomy, but also distinct to. It isn't rocket science. This is not rocket science. It's actually quite simple. And again, women need to understand their anatomy as well. The other reason women may be having fewer orgasms during sexual intercourse is sometimes sexual intercourse can be painful for women. It can be painful both because they may have endometritis or some sort of challenge, right? Physical challenge that makes sexual intercourse painful. And of course, women have experienced often a lot of trauma around sex and sexual intercourse. So these are very real and legitimate reasons why. So, is it in fact a misperception? Let's go back to the top. What do we think? Is it a misperception that women have fewer orgasms than men? And really, is this just about aging? This research study would tell you it's not about aging. It's a little bit about sexual orientation, and it's really about gender. I'm going to say to you before you panic that it might be about the question wording. If you ask about pleasure or intimacy and less about sexual intercourse, you might get a different answer, right? And so this is a big question, but my goal for you is to be thinking about how do we rise that number from 48% to 100% of the time women are having sexual intercourse. Now, what do you think? Do you agree? Do you see something different? Are you seeing a different mechanism that pushes women away from sexual pleasure in sexual intercourse? We'd love to hear what your thoughts are. Come to our Misperceived Instagram account, share through, send us a message. And in the meantime, good luck with the orgasms. As per usual, thanks for listening to Misperceived, where you don't need a PhD, but you just get to come hang out with me. I know this episode was short, but I hope your orgasms are long. Have a great week. This podcast was produced with the support of the incredible Sophie Squires, the wonderful Kate Danger, the fantastic Rich Berner, and the one and only, the best ever made, Serena Reagan. I would like to acknowledge that our podcast is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today.